Lieutenant Garrido, I'd like to start with you and return to the subject of bail reform and appropriate bail procedures. I had the privilege of serving my community as a federal prosecutor and later as a judge, so I understand what a critical part of the criminal process that is and how much it affects overall community safety. Will you elaborate for us, please, on the effect it is having on the law enforcement officers' ability to do their job when prosecutors don't seek detention hearings and judges are prohibited from considering community safety and likelihood of recidivism as factors in making appropriate bail determinations?
Well, it's just another nail in the coffin where we repeatedly see different things that embolden the bad guys and make these criminals feel that they're not going to be held accountable. So why should they care? They're not worried about getting arrested because they know they're going to be out right away. We oftentimes would joke, just because for years our criminal justice system in Chicago here and Cook County has been in such shambles that most of these offenders, they'll get off on technicalities or whatnot, but at least sometimes they would spend time in jail while waiting for their trial, so they would get at least some time served. Now that's out the window. So you've got the bad guys are just learning, and they're quickly learning because this stuff is broadcast everywhere, that they don't have to worry about any consequences. So it makes it extremely difficult for officers to do their job because you're now dealing with people that are even more combative than they normally would be.
You also touched on the subject of juvenile offenders. In your experience, tell me about some of the juvenile offenders you see. Is it important for prior juvenile offenses to be considered in the totality of the seriousness of a criminal's behavior and in future prosecution and sentencing or detention decisions?
Absolutely. We've seen time and again the gangbangers are actually using, they've done it for years. They always use the younger kids. They would use them to do their burglaries. They use them to hold their weapons. They use them to hold their drugs because they know that they're just going to get a slap on the wrist. So that's always been the case. But now it seems as though these young offenders are getting more dangerous, quite honestly. They're now shooting at people. They're now stealing cars and doing carjackings. Like I said, just the other day, the offenders were 4 of them, and they were ages 12 to 16. So we've got our juvenile criminal offenders, at least here in Chicago, are becoming more and more violent. So absolutely, that stuff should be considered.
Officer Yanez, you touched on the dismantling of the gang and gun specialized units. Would you elaborate for us, please, on why those units were established, why they're important, and why it is affecting the efficacy of your work not to have them anymore?
So I worked 7 District TAC for 4+ years, 4.5 years. And as John Garrido said, you have to learn your technique. Everyone learns their profession in a certain field, and you have officers that had experienced numerous years over the years of working with certain individuals, whether it be gang members, gun offenders, narcotics, and just being able to deal with it when it comes to saturation. But the units that were established were for basically common sense what they were named. The gangs were for officers that had prior knowledge with certain gang members or leaders, and they knew when a gang shooting happened and occurred where their retaliation would be, so we can focus on that area. As far as the gun teams, you know, they specialized in retrieving guns from offenders, gun offenders. Saturation was basically you saturated an area where there was going to be, where we had knowledge of like gang shooting, you know, we would saturate that area so there wasn't a retaliation. But when you dismantle that and you take away some of the perks, so they work 10-hour days as one of the perks, you have officers that have to be on the job, and you're arresting individuals, and then you have officers that are, you know, that takes a process. You know, you're arresting them, so it could take up to several hours to process on a criminal offender being charged with a weapon. So you also increase the overtime pay, you know, so it's just, yeah.
And Lieutenant Garrido, I'd like to also touch on the subject of officer discipline and the concept that officers are confronted with anonymous complaints against them and denied an opportunity to understand the allegations or confront the witnesses that might be making allegations against them. Would you share with us what is going on in that regard and how it is affecting officer morale?
It's a huge impact on morale. Just to give an example, we have officers that will, the complaint will come in, it's an anonymous complaint, the investigation will go on, and these investigations sometimes take 2, 3, 4 years. It's incredible. I had one investigation for us that was 9 years in the making. So these officers are going to work every day. They don't know when the next shoe is going to drop. They don't know where this investigation is going to go. They don't know if they're going to somehow be criminally prosecuted as well. It's demoralizing for the officers, and if you can imagine that officer that's sitting there on roll call every day, it's impacting his partners and other officers because they also know that he's going through it, and some of them are going through it as well. His investigations just go on and on and on because I don't know what the reason is. They're short-staffed, they're not conducting the proper investigations, whatever it is. And then allowing these anonymous complaints, people learn quick. Just complain against the police. You just put in a complaint. They lie a lot. I mean, there are a ton of these investigations are false allegations, and at least when you had to make them sign an affidavit, at least that helped reduce it a little bit, but by eliminating that now, anybody and everybody is making complaints against the officers.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Lieutenant,